The city was alive with the hum of everyday chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance, a cacophony that blended with honking horns and murmurs of restless crowds. It was another hot summer day, the kind where tempers flared as easily as the heat waves rising from the pavement. At the center of it all was Officer Kevin Daniels, a veteran cop with a reputation for being rough around the edges. Kevin prided himself on being old school, though some would argue he was more stuck in outdated ways than truly seasoned. Kevin was patrolling the streets in his squad car, a stern look etched on his face. He'd seen a lot in his years on the force, but not all of it had left him wiser. There was an edge to his authority, one that didn't always sit well with the community he was meant to protect. Today was no different. He felt the weight of his badge, but not the responsibility it carried. Just a few blocks away, Malik Johnson was wrapping up his shift as a paramedic. Known for his calm demeanor and a heart as big as the city he served, Malik had a reputation for saving lives without seeking applause. For him, the job was more than a paycheck, it was a calling. His dark blue uniform was a badge of honor, one he wore with pride despite the challenges he faced daily. Malik had dealt with it all: car crashes, heart attacks, and sometimes even the sting of prejudice that came from places he least expected. But nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen. The day took a sharp turn when a call came through Malik's radio. Priority 1, the dispatcher's voice crackled. Severe trauma. Multiple injuries. Ambulance requested immediately. Malik's partner, Lisa, glanced at him, her expression as serious as the situation demanded. Without missing a beat, they jumped into their ambulance and raced toward the scene. Every second mattered. As they approached the location, the streets seemed unusually tense. People were gathered in clusters, their faces reflecting shock and fear. Malik maneuvered the ambulance through the narrow lanes, his focus unwavering. When they arrived, the sight was heart-stopping. A young man, no older than 25, lay unconscious on the ground, his body battered and bleeding. The victim's friends hovered nearby, panic etched across their faces. "Help him," one of them pleaded, tears streaming down his face. Malik and Lisa worked swiftly, their movements synchronized like clockwork. The young man's pulse was weak, and time was slipping away. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Malik noticed something odd. A black SUV idling a few feet away, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, but he brushed it off. His priority was the patient, nothing else. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was parked a few streets over, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. A call came through his radio, something about suspicious activity near the intersection Malik had just left. Kevin sighed, muttering under his breath about wasting time on nonsense, before reluctantly heading toward the scene. When Kevin arrived, he immediately spotted the ambulance pulling away. Something about it rubbed him the wrong way, that he couldn't quite put his finger on it. His instincts, or perhaps his biases, kicked in. Kevin flicked on his siren and began tailing the ambulance. Inside, Malik and Lisa were too focused on stabilizing their patient to notice. The tension escalated when the ambulance came to a stop at a red light. Kevin, now convinced something was off, stepped out of his squad car and approached. He banged on the driver's window, startling Lisa. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. Lisa rolled down the window just enough to respond. "Officer, we're transporting a critical patient. We need to keep moving." But Kevin wasn't listening. His eyes darted to Malik, who was working tirelessly in the back. The sight seemed to ignite something in him, something ugly. "What's he doing back there?" Kevin demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. Malik looked up briefly, confusion flashing across his face. "I'm saving a life," he replied evenly, before turning his attention back to the patient. That wasn't enough for Kevin. He opened the ambulance doors, his hand resting on his holster. Malik stepped back instinctively, his heart pounding. "Officer, we don't have time for this," he exclaimed, trying to keep his voice steady. But Kevin wasn't hearing him. His assumptions had taken over, clouding any sense of reason. What happened next was a blur. Words were exchanged, tension boiled over, and in an instant, Kevin's fist connected with Malik's jaw. The force of the punch sent Malik stumbling backward, his head hitting the metal wall of the ambulance. Lisa screamed, and the patient's heart monitor let out a sharp, ominous beep. For a moment, everything stood still. Malik's vision blurred as he struggled to process what had just happened. Kevin stood there, his chest heaving, seemingly satisfied with his actions. But then, a sound shattered the silence, a faint, raspy voice from the stretcher. "Kevin." The officer froze, his eyes widening in shock. He turned toward the patient, his face draining of color. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place, and Kevin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The young man on the stretcher wasn't just any victim. He was someone Kevin knew, someone who could change everything. And just like that, the air grew heavier, the tension unbearable. Malik clutched his throbbing jaw, his mind racing with questions. Lisa, still shaken, tried to steady her hands as she checked the patient's vitals. And Kevin? He was rooted to the spot, his world unraveling in real time. Who was the man on the stretcher? What did he mean to Kevin? And most importantly, how would this story end? Stay tuned, because the truth is about to come out. And it's more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Kevin stood frozen, his mind spinning as the young man on the stretcher struggled to form more words. The faint whisper of his name seemed to echo in Kevin's ears, louder than the wail of nearby sirens or Lisa's panicked voice as she called out for backup. This wasn't just another incident. It was personal, and Kevin felt the weight of it settle heavily on his chest. But how could this be? What was this young man doing here in this condition? And why was his name the only thing he could muster? Malik, still recovering from the blow, pressed a hand to his aching jaw as he steadied himself against the ambulance wall. He locked eyes with Kevin, anger flickering in his gaze. "You've done enough," Malik said, his voice firm but controlled. He turned his attention back to the patient, checking his pulse and adjusting the oxygen mask over his face. The young man's breathing was shallow, his lips barely moving. Malik had seen injuries like this before. Time was slipping away. Lisa, her hands trembling, glanced between Kevin and Malik. "We need to go," she urged, her voice breaking. "If we wait any longer, he won't make it." She glanced down at her phone, where the dispatch center was still buzzing with updates. The hospital wasn't far, but every second they spent here was another second lost. Kevin's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, but he stopped. The weight of what had just happened bore down on him like a heavy stone. His training, his years of experience, all seemed to vanish in the face of this one moment. He looked at the young man again, searching for something familiar. And then it hit him. A memory, faint but undeniable. It was a warm summer evening years ago. Kevin was still a rookie, eager to prove himself. He had responded to a minor disturbance at a local park, where a group of teenagers had been playing basketball after hours. One of them had stood out. A tall, lanky kid with a quick smile and an undeniable talent on the court. Kevin had been stern, warning the group to clear out before curfew, but something about that kid had stuck with him. His name had been Jaden. Kevin's throat went dry as he looked at the young man on the stretcher. Could it be the same Jaden, the boy he had once dismissed as just another neighborhood kid with too much energy and not enough direction? The possibility sent a chill down his spine. But there was no time to dwell on it. Lisa's voice snapped him back to reality. "Kevin, move," she yelled, her tone sharper now. "If you're not going to help, then get out of the way." For a moment, Kevin hesitated. His instincts told him to maintain control of the situation, to assert his authority. But something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, urged him to step aside. Reluctantly, he moved back, allowing Malik and Lisa to shut the ambulance doors. The engine rolled to life, and within seconds, they were speeding toward the hospital. Inside the ambulance, Malik worked tirelessly to stabilize Jaden. His hands moved quickly, his years of experience kicking in despite the chaos swirling around him. Lisa kept her eyes on the road, weaving through traffic with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. but the tension was palpable. Neither of them spoke, though the unspoken question lingered. Who was Jaden to Kevin, and why had things escalated the way they had? Meanwhile, Kevin stood by his squad car, staring after the ambulance as it disappeared down the street. He felt an unfamiliar pang of regret. What had come over him? He replayed the events in his mind, trying to make sense of his actions. It wasn't like him to lose control, at least not to this extent. Sure, he had a reputation for being tough, but this was different. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was personal, that he couldn't yet figure out why. As he climbed back into his car, Kevin's radio crackled to life. All units, be advised. The victim from the earlier incident has been identified as Jaden Carter, age 24. Family notified. Investigators en route to the hospital. Kevin's heart sank. The name confirmed his worst fear. It was Jaden, the same kid from all those years ago. But how had he ended up in this situation? And more importantly, what was Kevin going to do about it? The hospital was a flurry of activity when the ambulance arrived. Nurses and doctors rushed to meet them, quickly transferring Jaden to a gurney and wheeling him into the emergency room. Malik followed closely, rattling off details about Jaden's condition. Lisa stayed behind, slumping against the ambulance as the adrenaline of the moment began to wear off. Malik's mind raced as he handed Jaden off to the medical team. He couldn't shake the image of Kevin, standing there like a deer caught in headlights. Something about the way he had reacted, hesitant, almost guilty, didn't sit right. And then there was the question of Jaden himself. Who was he, and why did he seem to know Kevin? The pieces of the puzzle didn't add up, but Malik had a sinking feeling that the truth would be more complicated than he imagined. Back at the station, Kevin sat in his office, staring at a blank report form. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened without incriminating himself? He thought about Jaden, about that summer evening all those years ago. He had been just a kid then, full of potential. And now? Now he was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that he had played a role in whatever path had led Jaden here. As the hours ticked by, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Kevin knew he couldn't avoid the truth forever. But he also knew that facing it would mean confronting not just what had happened today, but the choices he had made throughout his career. Choices that had shaped not only his life, but the lives of those around him. At the hospital, Malik sat in the waiting room, his thoughts racing. He had done everything he could for Jaden, but the questions remained. What had happened to him before the ambulance arrived? Who had hurt him? And why? And what role, if any, had Kevin played in all of this? Malik didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth had a way of coming out, whether people were ready for it or not. As the night stretched on, the city outside continued its restless hum. But for those caught in the web of this unfolding story, time seemed to stand still. Kevin, Malik, Lisa, and Jaden were all bound together now, their lives intertwined in ways none of them could have foreseen. And though the answers were still out of reach, one thing was clear: this was far from over. The hospital was quieter now, the chaotic energy of the ambulance bay replaced by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Malik sat in a hard plastic chair near the emergency room doors, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wasn't used to staying in one place for long, but something about this situation kept him rooted. Maybe it was the look on Jaden's face where they'd brought him in. Or maybe it was the lingering image of Kevin, frozen in guilt and confusion. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something hidden beneath the surface, and he intended to find out what it was. A nurse emerged from the double doors, her expression giving away little. Malik sat up straighter. Is he? He's stable for now, she said, her tone professional but kind. The doctors are still running tests, but his injuries are severe. It's a good thing you got him here when you did. Malik nodded, relief washing over him, though it was quickly replaced by the same burning questions. Has anyone come to see him? Family, maybe. The nurse hesitated, glancing down at her clipboard. Not yet, but someone's on their way. His mother, I think. She called about an hour ago. Malik thanked her and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Jaden's mother. The thought brought a mix of emotions. He wondered if she knew what had happened, if she had any answers about how Jaden ended up in that alley. Malik's curiosity grew, but he knew better than to push too hard. For now, he would wait. Across town, Kevin sat in his dimly lit office, the glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The blank report form still stared back at him, and his fingers hovered over the keys, motionless. He had started typing a dozen times, only to delete every word. How could he write the truth when he barely understood it himself? A knock at the door broke his concentration. Kevin looked up to see his partner, Officer Riley, standing in the doorway. Riley was younger, newer to the force, but sharp enough to notice when something wasn't right. "You good?" Riley asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Kevin shrugged, his shoulders tense. "Just writing up my report." "About the ambulance thing?" Riley asked, pulling up a chair. He leaned back, studying Kevin carefully. "Word's already spreading. You know how this place is." Kevin frowned but said nothing. Of course, the precinct would be buzzing. Incidents like this didn't stay quiet for long. Riley leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know what happened out there, but I know you. This isn't like you. So what gives?" For a moment, Kevin considered brushing him off, but the weight of everything was too much to keep bottled up. "The kid in the ambulance," Kevin said slowly. "I think I know him. From years ago." Riley raised an eyebrow. And I screwed up," Kevin admitted, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. "I acted before thinking. It's complicated." Riley nodded, not pressing for details. Instead, he offered something Kevin didn't expect. "If it's complicated, you've got to figure it out before it gets worse. You don't want this hanging over your head." Kevin sighed, his frustration evident. Riley wasn't wrong, but knowing what he needed to do didn't make it any easier. The truth was tangled in a web of emotions Kevin hadn't faced in years: guilt, regret, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. At the hospital, Malik's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a woman who looked both exhausted and determined. She was in her late 40s, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. Malik didn't need to ask who she was. He knew instinctively. This was Jaden's mother. She spotted him immediately, her expression wary but polite. "You're the paramedic, right? The one who brought my son in?" "Yes," Malik said, standing. He introduced himself, extending a hand. She took it briefly, her grip firm despite her obvious fatigue. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving him." Malik nodded, unsure how to respond. There was so much he wanted to ask, but he didn't know where to start. Before he could say anything, the nurse returned, guiding Jaden's mother toward the room where her son was being treated. Malik watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. He hoped she could provide some clarity, but he also knew there were things even she might not understand. As the night wore on, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, though none of them fit together just yet. Kevin couldn't stop replaying his memories of Jaden, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Malik kept turning over the events of the day in his mind, searching for answers that remained just out of reach. And Jaden's mother sat by his bedside, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort, even as questions lingered in her own mind. Meanwhile, back in the precinct, Officer Riley couldn't shake his curiosity. Something about Kevin's reaction had struck a nerve, and he decided to do a little digging. He pulled up old reports, scanning through files that stretched back years. It wasn't long before he stumbled across something that made him pause: a police report from nearly a decade ago, filed by none other than Kevin Daniels. It was a minor incident, nothing out of the ordinary, but one name stood out: Jaden Carter. Riley's brow furrowed as he read through the report. It was about a group of teenagers, loitering in the park after hours. Kevin had been the responding officer, and while no arrests had been made, There were notes about a verbal warning and a brief altercation. It didn't seem like much, but something about it nagged at Riley. He printed the report and slipped it into his bag, deciding to keep it to himself for now. If Kevin wasn't ready to talk, Riley wasn't going to push, but he also wasn't going to let it go. At the hospital, Jaden stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. His mother leaned in closer, her heart leaping at the small movement. Malik, who had been standing outside the room, noticed the change and stepped inside. "He's waking up," he said softly, his voice tinged with both hope and caution. Jaden's lips moved, forming barely audible words. His mother leaned closer, straining to hear. "What is it, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. But the words that escaped Jaden's lips weren't what she expected. "Kevin," he whispered, his voice weak but unmistakable. Malik's eyes widened, and he exchanged a glance with Jaden's mother. The name hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Malik's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was far from clear. And as the tension built, one thing became certain. The truth, when it finally came out, would change everything. The tension in the hospital room was palpable. Malik stood frozen, his gaze locked on Jaden, as the young man struggled to stay conscious. Jaden's mother gripped his hand tightly, her face etched with worry. The name Kevin still lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered. Malik didn't know what to make of it, but his gut told him this was no coincidence. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was one Malik wasn't sure he wanted to see. Jaden's mother leaned closer, her voice soft but urgent. "What about Kevin, baby? What are you trying to say?" Jaden's eyelids fluttered, his breathing uneven. His voice was faint, barely audible. He was there. Kevin was there. His words trailed off, and his body went limp again, as if the effort to speak had drained what little energy he had left. Malik's stomach tightened. He glanced at Jaden's mother, who looked equally confused and alarmed. "Do you know who Kevin is?" Malik asked cautiously, his voice low. She shook her head, her brows furrowed. "I don't. Jaden never mentioned anyone by that name. Why would he be talking about a police officer?" Malik's mind raced. There was no doubt in his mind now. Jaden had recognized Kevin back at the scene. But why? What connection could a young paramedic, a critically injured man, and a veteran cop have? And why did it feel like Kevin was hiding something? Meanwhile, across town, Kevin sat in his squad car, parked on a quiet street. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He couldn't shake the image of Jaden on that stretcher, the way his lips had barely moved as he whispered his name. Kevin had spent years building walls around himself, burying memories he didn't want to face. But now, those walls were crumbling, and the past was clawing its way to the surface. The radio crackled to life, pulling Kevin from his thoughts. It was Riley. "Hey, Kevin, you still at the station?" Kevin hesitated before answering. "No, why?" There was a pause on the other end, then Riley's voice came back, carefully measured. "I was just looking into that ambulance situation. There's something I think you should see." Kevin's heart sank. He knew what Riley was hinting at, and he wasn't ready for it. "I'll be there soon," he said reluctantly, ending the call. As he drove back to the precinct, Kevin's mind wandered to the summer night years ago, when he first met Jaden. The boy had been full of life back then, always smiling, always talking about his dreams of becoming a doctor. Kevin had admired that about him, even if he'd never said it out loud. But something had happened after that night, something Kevin had buried deep, even from himself. And now, it was all rushing back. At the hospital, Malik paced outside Jaden's room. He couldn't sit still, not with so many unanswered questions swirling in his mind. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of two detectives, their expressions serious as they approached the nurse's station. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, glanced in Malik's direction before speaking with the nurse. Malik caught snippets of their conversation, words like incident, suspect, and officer involvement. His pulse quickened. Were they here because of Kevin? Did they already know something he didn't? Malik decided he couldn't wait any longer. He walked up to the detectives, his tone respectful but firm. "Excuse me, I'm the paramedic who brought Jaden in. Is there any update on what happened to him?" The detectives exchanged a glance before the older one spoke. "We're still gathering information. What can you tell us about the scene?" Malik recounted the events of the day, careful not to omit any details. He mentioned Kevin's behavior, the tension between them, and the way Jaden had seemed to recognize him. The detectives listened intently, their expressions giving nothing away. "Did Officer Daniels say anything to you about the victim?" one of them asked. Malik shook his head. "Not much. He seemed rattled, though, like he knew Jaden personally." The detectives thanked him and moved toward Jaden's room. Malik watched them go, his unease growing by the second. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they were looking for would lead back to Kevin, and that those answers wouldn't be easy to face. At the precinct, Kevin walked into his office to find Riley waiting for him, a file folder open on the desk. Riley looked up, his expression serious. "I found something," he said, sliding the folder toward Kevin. "It's from a few years back. A report you filed about a group of kids at the park." Kevin's chest tightened as he glanced at the report. He remembered that night vividly, though he had tried to forget. "What about it?" he asked, his voice guarded. "One of the kids you mentioned, Jaden Carter. Same name as the guy from today," Riley said. He leaned back in his chair, studying Kevin carefully. "What happened that night, Kevin?" Kevin exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "It was just a routine call. A bunch of kids hanging out after hours. I told them to clear out, and that was it." "But it wasn't just it, was it?" Riley pressed. "Something happened, didn't it?" Kevin didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, the memories flooding back with alarming clarity. He remembered how Jaden had stood up to him that night, unafraid to speak his mind. He remembered the argument that had followed, the way he had let his temper get the best of him. And he remembered walking away, thinking he had done the right thing. But now he wasn't so sure. Back at the hospital, Jaden stared again, his eyes fluttering open. His mother leaned in close, her heart pounding. "Jaden, can you hear me?" Jaden's gaze was unfocused, but he nodded weakly. Malik stepped into the room, his presence steady and reassuring. "Jaden, you're safe now," Malik said. "But we need to know what happened. Can you tell us?" Jaden's voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear enough to send a chill down Malik's spine. "Kevin, he was there." The room fell silent, the weight of Jaden's words sinking in. Malik exchanged a glance with Jaden's mother, then turned back to him. "What do you mean? What did Kevin do?" Jaden struggled to speak, his voice trembling. He knew. He knew who I was, and he didn't help. He let it happen." Malik's blood ran cold. The story was far from over, but one thing was certain. Kevin had a lot to answer for. And as the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place, the tension reached its breaking point. The truth was close, tantalizingly so, but it remained just out of reach, leaving everyone on edge as they braced for what was to come. Malik felt a heavy weight settle in his chest after Jaden's faint words. The accusation was clear, but the full story wasn't. He crouched down beside Jaden's bed, lowering his voice to a calm, steady tone. "Jaden, you have to help me understand. What do you mean Kevin knew? What did he let happen?" Jaden's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, his energy waning. His mother squeezed his hand gently, her voice trembling. "Stay with us, Jaden. Please, baby, we need to know." After a long pause, Jaden took a shallow breath and whispered. That night, in the alley, he saw them coming, but he didn't stop them. He turned away. Malik's throat tightened. Them? Who was Jaden talking about? He tried to piece it together, but the gaps in Jaden's fragmented explanation only deepened the mystery. Before Malik could press further, the nurse appeared, gently ushering him and Jaden's mother out of the room. "He needs to rest," she said softly, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Malik stepped into the corridor, his mind raced with questions. If Kevin had turned away, What had he been avoiding? And more importantly, who had attacked Jaden? Malik couldn't shake the sinking feeling that whatever Kevin had done, or failed to do, was at the center of this. At the precinct, Kevin stared at Riley in silence, his heart pounding as he processed Jaden's name and the report from years ago. He hadn't thought about that night in a long time, but it was all coming back now, sharper than ever. Kevin could still see the group of teens laughing and talking in the dimly lit park, their voices carrying over the warm summer air. He remembered how Jaden had stood out, confident, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge authority. "I didn't do anything wrong that night," Kevin muttered, more to himself than to Riley. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. Had he done enough? Could he have prevented whatever had happened since then? Kevin shook his head, frustrated. It was just a warning, nothing serious. Riley leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Then why does it seem like this is eating you up inside?" Kevin didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past Riley and left the office, needing air, needing space. Outside, the cool night breeze did little to calm his nerves. His mind kept circling back to Jaden, to the way he'd whispered Kevin's name in the ambulance. There was something Kevin wasn't seeing, a piece of the puzzle just out of reach. And then it hit him, a memory he hadn't thought about in years. It wasn't just the night at the park. It was a few weeks later, during one of his routine patrols. He had seen Jaden again, this time with a different group of people, older men who didn't seem to have his best interest at heart. Kevin had thought about intervening, but decided against it. He had told himself it wasn't his problem, that Jaden would figure things out on his own. Now Kevin couldn't help but wonder if that decision had set Jaden on a path to where he was now. Back at the hospital, Malik's frustration was growing. He couldn't just stand by and wait. Something about this entire situation didn't sit right with him, and he needed answers. He pulled out his phone and searched Kevin's name, scrolling through news articles and public records. It didn't take long to find mentions of Officer Kevin Daniels, commendations, cases he'd worked, community events. On the surface, Kevin appeared to be a model officer. But as Malik dug deeper, he'd found whispers of complaints, minor incidents swept under the rug. Nothing overt, but enough to suggest a pattern. Malik was still scrolling when a familiar voice startled him. "You're looking at him too." He turned to see Riley standing the whole way, holding a file. Malik straightened. "You know something, don't you?" Riley hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I think Kevin's involved in something bigger than he's letting on," he admitted. "And I think he knows it too." Malik frowned, his frustration evident. "Then why hasn't he come clean? Jaden's in there fighting for his life, and Kevin's out there what? Protecting himself." Riley shook his head. "I don't think it's that simple. Kevin's not a bad guy, but he's made mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes pile up until you can't see a way out." Before Malik could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his colleagues at the ambulance station. A brief but cryptic note. "Asterisk, you might want to check the footage from the alley. I pulled it before the cops got there." Asterisk. Malik's pulse quickened as he clicked the link. The grainy video showed the moments leading up to their arrival. Jaden was visible, backing away from two shadowy figures. They were shouting, though the audio was muffled. Then a third figure appeared, Kevin. He was standing just a few feet away, watching. Malik's heart sank as he watched Kevin take a step back, his hand hovering near his radio. But he didn't call for backup. He didn't move to intervene. Instead, he turned and walked away as the two men closed in on Jaden. The footage cut out just as the fight began. Malik looked up at Riley, his face pale. He saw it happen. He was there, and he didn't stop it. Riley's expression hardened as he processed the implications. "We need to confront him," he said firmly. But Malik wasn't so sure. Kevin's actions, or lack thereof, had put everything into question. And as Malik stared at the screen, he couldn't help but wonder what had kept Kevin from stepping in. Was it fear, guilt, or something even darker? The stakes had never been higher. With Jaden's life hanging in the balance and Kevin's choices under scrutiny, the truth was closer than ever. But as Malik and R.A.C.I.S.T prepared to confront Kevin, one thing was clear. The answers they were about to uncover would change everything, for Jaden, for Kevin, and for everyone caught in the web of their shared past. Malik and R.A.C.I.S.T didn't waste any time. They knew confronting Kevin could be risky, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. They tracked him down at a small diner near the precinct, where he sat alone in a corner booth, stirring a cup of coffee with a distant look in his eyes. Malik's pulse quickened as they approached. The confrontation felt like the tipping point, the moment where everything would either unravel or come together. Kevin looked up as they neared, his jaw tightening. He knew why they were there. Without waiting for an invitation, Malik slid into the booth across from him, Riley standing nearby. The silence was heavy, the tension crackling like a live wire. "We need to talk," Malik said firmly, his voice low but steady. "About what happened in that alley." Kevin didn't respond right away. He stared down at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, almost resigned. "I didn't think anyone would ever find out," he admitted. "But I guess it was only a matter of time." Malik leaned forward, his eyes locked on Kevin's. "Why didn't you stop it? You saw Jaden, and you just walked away." Kevin exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I was protecting him," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "But I realize now I made it worse." His confession hit Malik like a punch to the gut. Protecting him. From what? Kevin hesitated, glancing at R.A.C.I.S.T before looking back at Malik. It wasn't random, Malik. Those men, they weren't just anyone. They were after Jaden because of me. Malik's breath caught. The implications were staggering. "What do you mean they were after him because of you? What did you do?" Kevin swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. "A few years ago, I made some bad decisions. Got involved with the wrong people, looking the other way when I shouldn't have. I thought it was harmless at the time. Just a few favors, nothing serious. But it got out of control. Those guys you saw in the video, they're part of a crew I used to work with. They found out Jaden was connected to me, and they used him to send a message." Malik's head spun as he tried to process Kevin's words. "You're telling me this was about you? Jaden got hurt because of your past." Kevin nodded miserably. "I thought if I stayed out of it, if I didn't intervene, they'd leave him alone. But I was wrong. I didn't want to drag him into my mess, and instead I put him right in the middle of it." Riley, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "You should have reported them, Kevin. You should have done the right thing." Kevin's voice cracked as he replied. "I know. I've been carrying that guilt for years, hoping it would just go away, but it never does." Malik's anger flared. "You had a chance to make it right, and you didn't take it. Jaden trusted you. He looked up to you, and you let him down." Kevin's shoulders slumped under the weight of Malik's words. "I know," he whispered, "and I'll never forgive myself for it." Before Malik could respond, Kevin's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's them," he said quietly, his hands shaking as he picked up the phone. He answered hesitantly, his voice strained. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was loud enough for Malik and R.A.C.I.S.T to hear. "You've got one last chance, Daniels. Clean up your mess, or we'll finish the job." Kevin's face went pale as he hung up, his hands trembling. Malik stood abruptly, his resolve hardening. "We're not letting them get away with this. You're coming with us to the precinct, and you're telling everything you know." Kevin didn't resist. He followed Malik and R.A.C.I.S.T out of the diner, his steps heavy with the weight of his decision. At the station, he gave a full confession, detailing his connection to the crew and the events that had led to Jaden's assault. The officers immediately launched an investigation, tracking down the men involved. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Jaden's condition took a turn for the worse. His mother sat by his bedside, praying for a miracle. Malik arrived just in time to hear the heart monitor flatline, a shrill sound cutting through the room like a knife. Panic set in as the medical team rushed to save him, their efforts frantic and determined. And then, against all odds, Jaden's heart started beating again. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but he was alive. Malik let out a shaky exhale, his emotions overwhelming him. In the days that followed, the men responsible for Jaden's attack were arrested, thanks to Kevin's testimony. But the story didn't end there. As Malik visited Jaden in the hospital, he learned the final, unexpected twist. Jaden had known about Kevin's past all along. He had seen the same men in his neighborhood before, watching him, following him. He had pieced together the connection and tried to confront Kevin about it, but Kevin had shut him down. Jaden had been trying to protect Kevin in his own way, hoping to keep the secret buried. In the end, both men had been caught in a web of guilt and silence, each trying to shield the other and failing. But now, with the truth finally out, they had a chance to start over, to rebuild the trust that had been broken and to move forward, no longer weighed down by secrets. As Malik left the hospital, he couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet relief. The scars of what had happened would remain, but so would the lessons. Sometimes, the only way to truly protect someone is to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. And sometimes, even the worst mistakes can lead to redemption if you're willing to fight for it.